Welcome to another edition of Flashpoints with CBS News national security analyst Juan Zarate. I'm Andy Triay, CBS News producer. Juan, welcome.
Thank you, Andy. Good to see you.
Let's start with Pakistan and the killing of Osama bin Laden. We all know what happened in the compound, but what's going on with the relationship with a very important ally and a very troublesome ally, Pakistan.
Right. I think one of the most important strategic aftershocks of the bin Laden killing is what it's doing to the U.S.-Pakistan relationship, which was already rocky, which was already incredibly tense. We've talked about this on Flashpoint, but what this has done is really created another breach between the countries. The fact that the raid happened deep inside Pakistan was humiliating to the Pakistanis, and in particular to the military, which is seen as a pillar of the state in Pakistan. Not only was it humiliating because the Americans came across the border, were able to, in an undisturbed fashion, go into the heart of Abbottabad, their garrison city, and take out bin Laden, but also real questions about who knew about bin Laden and why they didn't know more. If, in fact, it was this grand intelligence failure, as Pakistani officials have said, then who fell down on the job? The intelligence services, which are vaunted, and the military, which is seen as the safeguard against India, really seem to have failed. And so you now have calls for inquiries. The Prime Minister has launched an inquiry internally to look not just at the failings internally, but also why Pakistan's sovereignty was breached by the U.S. So we're at a point of critical tension between the United States and Pakistan.
But let's talk about the failures of the Pakistanis. You had Osama bin Laden living in this compound for 5 or 6 years. You had the U.S. military come in the middle of the night and conduct an hour-long raid with 2 helicopters landing, 2 others circling above. And then you also had the fact that they didn't know that Osama bin Laden was living there.
Yeah.
I mean,
and you also have the fact that the Pakistanis were not clued in beforehand. The purported allies of the United States didn't notify them. So that, in some ways, was humiliating for the political leadership as well. So,
but the army looks like it will survive this just fine.
I think it will survive. I think what you see, though, for the first time, a lot of questions internally within Pakistan. Certainly this is going to feed a lot of anti-Americanism that was already there, a lot of conspiracy theories, but it's also going to call into question the military and the intelligence services. What I see, though, Andy, is this is going to get more tense before it gets better. I think the administration is going to try very hard to give the Pakistanis breathing space, and you see that in how we talk about these issues. They're not accusing the Pakistanis of anything publicly. Behind the scenes, they're going to get very tough. But I think this is going to get worse because you already see a little bit of a tit for tat. For example, the Pakistanis have been playing with access to bin Laden's wives, whom they have in custody. They said they're going to give access to the Americans. They haven't yet. They've toyed with this notion of giving the remnants of this stealth helicopter to the Chinese. They know that's going to be a thumb in the side of the Americans.
Right.
We have, by the way, a couple of other issues. If, for example, we get credible information to follow and to go get somebody like Ayman al-Zawahiri, the next leader of al-Qaeda in Pakistan, what do we do? Do we do something similar to what we just did with bin Laden, or do we clue the Pakistanis in?
But the Pakistanis haven't done something that they've done a few times in the past, which is shut off access for the land routes into Afghanistan to resupply our troops there.
No, that's true. And I think the Pakistanis and the Americans are trying to, though there's this tit for tat, and though there's tension, deep tension, I think the authorities are trying to tamp down any escalation of the tension. And if the Pakistanis were to close off, for example, the Khyber pathway that provides some supplies at Afghanistan, quite a bit of supplies to our NATO forces, that would be a real signal that the Pakistanis are playing hardball.
But we have not seen that yet.
We haven't seen that yet. And they know, and we know that that's a card that they can play, but we can play other cards as well. Something else to watch, Andy, you're about to see the start of a trial in Chicago, the Rana trial, which involves David Headley, and the Mumbai trial, the Mumbai attacks. What you'll have there is some implications, if not direct testimony, about Pakistani government involvement, intelligence involvement in the Mumbai attacks. That will be seen in Pakistan as that hits the papers as further evidence that the United States is trying to embarrass the Pakistanis, and it will be seen as part of a strategic effort. Even though we know that these cases sort of have their own pace and they're not necessarily coordinated, in Pakistan this will be seen as a broad assault on their nationhood, and they'll see it as part of the humiliation, and it's going to add to the tension.
All right, and that starts in a couple of weeks in Chicago.
That's right.
All right, let's move on to Syria. In mid-March, we started seeing protests against President Assad. They've done nothing but escalate. The Syrian army has moved into cities across the country. More than 700 people killed, almost 800 people killed, according to Human Rights Watchers, thousands injured. What is going on in Syria?
Well, Syria, I think, is sort of the worst untold story. I think it's been eclipsed by the bin Laden story, et cetera, but the repression has continued. And I think what you have in Syria is the Alawite regime led by Bashar al-Assad making a decision that they're going to use force to survive. The lesson that they learned from watching Iran and watching the other regimes in the region is that to survive, you need to cut off media access, you need to cut off the head of the demonstrations, and so they've taken the leaders of the protest movements and dissidents into custody, disappeared them, and they use force, overwhelming, demonstrable force, and that's why they've rolled tanks into places like Hamas and other cities, and really have been devastating. And one of the challenges here, Andy, is we don't have a lot of visuals coming out of Libya. We did that. We had a lot of visuals
out of Syria.
Out of Syria, sorry. We did in Egypt, we did in Tunisia, but not out of Syria, and that's a real challenge. The other thing is, and you've seen this.
So the world's not seeing what's going on in Syria. They're not seeing the crackdown. They're not seeing the 700 and some odd people who have been killed.
And some estimates over 1,000. Who knows? We just don't know for sure, and that's part of the challenge here. In Libya, we could visualize it in some ways. In Egypt, we could.
We saw it happening
right.
live.
And in many ways, it forced the policy discussion. Here, and you've seen this in some op-eds and things that are frustrated at the American response. The question is, when are we going to declare the Assad regime illegitimate, the way we did with Mubarak, the way we did with Gaddafi, to say, not only are these human rights atrocities, but this is an illegitimate regime given what it's doing to its people. And oh, by the way, this isn't a friendly regime to the United States. Yeah. It's supported foreign fighters into Iraq. It's Iran's proxy in the region. It's destabilized into Lebanon. At some point, we've got to make a decision from a policy perspective as to whether or not this is a regime worth trying to topple, or if we're just going to stand by the wayside and watch these atrocities.
We have seen this week the rhetoric from the administration increase a little bit. Secretary Clinton was very tough Thursday morning at a meeting with NATO allies. We've seen the rhetoric from NATO being raised. But is there really much the United States and its allies can do in Syria other than raise the rhetoric?
Well, I think rhetoric's important. Unfortunately, the rhetoric's been kind of following events, and it's been reactive to the increasing atrocities we've seen on the ground. We've also seen the administration and now the EU use sanctions to go after Syrian officials. I think that's important. One of the things that we haven't done, though, for example, is declare that we're going to go after Assad and his family's funds, to actually declare a leadership asset hunt, the way we've done in the other cases in the Middle East. And so that's one thing we can do. We've done some good work behind the scenes in the UN. Now Syria's withdrawn from its position or attempted position on the Human Rights Commission. That will be replaced by Kuwait. And so there are little things here and there you can do to pressure, but I think the critical thing is to actually make a determination that we want to see regime change, and then you can do a whole host of things. Not talking about military intervention, but a whole host of things that lead you in that direction.
All right, well, let's move on to a place where there was a revolution, a successful revolution, Egypt. And there was a lot of euphoria in the streets. But what we've seen since then is a little war going on between the Coptic Christians who've been attacked by radical Muslim groups there, and there are 12 people killed over the weekend.
Right. I think the sectarian tensions are the most immediate and near-term threat to the revolution and to the democratic, pluralistic sort of Arab Spring that we imagined for Cairo. What you have is this split. You have the Coptic Christians, which make up about 10% of Egyptian society, under assault. They very much feel under assault. They feel like the government and the military is not protecting them. You've had church burnings. You've had people killed. You've had allegations of kidnappings. And you have really extreme Muslim groups, Salafist groups, who are sort of a fundamentalist wing of Islam, really sort of being the tip of the spear against the Christians and fomenting the sectarian divide. This has a real chance, unfortunately, to rip apart Egyptian society, which for the most part has been unified in the wake of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring has not really been about Muslim or Christian. It's been about Egypt. And what you see is increasing tension and dissatisfaction, especially with the Coptic Christians, about where this level of violence is going. And if the Coptic Christians don't feel like the government's protecting them, don't feel like the country is headed in the right direction, that can create huge divisions and huge problems for this revolution. And
a lot of this is caused by the absence of a strongman, by the absence of the Mubarak regime when it was in power. kept this
tamped it down. Yeah, I think the security services have for a long time sort of quelled violence, whether it's low-level street violence or high-level sectarian violence, or even Al-Qaeda related violence. And so there has been a sense of a vacuum of security, which is feeding into the sense of illegitimacy of this current government and of the process. The other thing that's interesting, Andy, to watch is how much of this is a reflection of a broader and more fundamental debate about the nature of Egyptian society moving forward. How much of this is going to be defined from a political perspective by Islam? Is this going to be seen as an Islamist state, soft or otherwise? And what role does pluralism have in this new Egypt? And that's really, I think, deeply embedded at the heart of this question of the conflict between Coptic Christians and Muslims in Egypt.
And finally, let's move on to Palestine, where we've seen a unity government between Hamas and Fatah.
Yeah, huge news over the last week and a half. They announced in Cairo a unity deal between the ruling Fatah faction of running the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and the Hamas terrorist organization as defined by the U.S. and the European Union, which runs Gaza. There's been a long-standing split ever since Hamas took over Gaza physically. Ongoing physical battles between
this goes back 4 years, right?
4 years, exactly. And there's been a huge divide, a huge push politically within the Palestinian quarters and also in the region to try to get the sides to come together.
But what's the importance of that?
The importance of this is twofold. One is there's always been a sense that you can't have a real Palestinian state if you have this divide within the Palestinian people, especially the geographic divide between the West Bank and Gaza, but more importantly, this kind of strategic political divide between Fatah, which is seen as more moderate and is willing to work with Israel, and Hamas, which still has as its platform agenda the destruction of the state of Israel. So in terms of the state of Palestine, or the potential state of Palestine, which we're marching toward, potentially announced by the UN and voted on by the General Assembly in September, there's a sense that you have to have unity within the Palestinian people. The problem with that, and the other significance of this, is the fact that Hamas has not rejected its core principles, which are antithetical to the state of Israel, violent at its core, and frankly anti-American. The Haniya, the head of Hamas, came out with, in essence, a eulogy of bin Laden after the killing at the hands of Navy SEALs. So the significance here is this really throws a wrench in any real peace process, because the Israelis now do not want to deal with the Palestinian Authority or this unity government. They've already cut off funding, the commercial funding that they provide, the taxes that they help provide in terms of shipments and things. Right. And this has called into question the very kind of structure of how the West has been dealing with the Palestinian Authority. People like the Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, who's seen as a credible, trustworthy voice, is now potentially on the outside. Hamas wants him out of the government. And he's really been the linchpin for the establishment of a potential Palestinian state in the West Bank. And so this has huge ripple effects that I think we're just starting to see. Real question, though, as to whether or not the unity deal can survive the real conflicts between these groups, and frankly, the unresolved questions as to where this Palestinian state, if it becomes a state, where it's going.
All right. Juan Zarate, thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy.